The opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Cable 14, its sponsors, or its shareholders, Cogeco Cable, Shaw Cable, and Source Cable Limited.
Hi everyone, I'm Bob Bratina, the Mayor of the City of Hamilton, and this is a rare opportunity. We're going to have the City Manager of the City of Hamilton joining us in conversation, Chris Murray. Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
We want to talk about something that's probably not a big coffee shop topic. It's called Service Delivery Review, and people want to know why the Tiger Cats didn't play so well in that last game, or why the stadium's be turned sideways, but Service Delivery Review, and it's one of the most important conversations we're having as a city, and I want to help you work it through with our listeners and viewers in terms of what that means. But before we get to Service Delivery Review, you made quite an impressive presentation to the Chamber of Commerce not so long ago, and we have some slides that you used that day to let people know just how well we're doing and how others see Hamilton. And if we could look at the first slide, how others see Hamilton, you will see the presentation that Chris made. And why don't you share what we're seeing on the screen?
Sure. First of all, I think it's in some cases unfortunate that we have to accept the praise of others about how well we're doing and not sometimes listen to ourselves. But the Conference Board of Canada is judging us to have the fastest growing economy in Ontario. So we're pegged to be growing at a pace of about 2.5%. We're ranked #1 in the country for attracting industrial commercial development according to Site Selection magazine. And again, a lot of that has to do with the great work that the Hamilton Port Authority is doing on the waterfront, as well as our industrial parks. We're the best place in Ontario to invest over the next 5 years, according to the Real Estate Investment Network. We're also cited as one of the top cities in North America for quality of life. And then lastly, but not least, we're ranked 2nd in the country in use of social media. So our numbers are very good. Right now, in fact, we're outstripping some of the progress that we had made 2 years ago in terms of building permits.
So then we move on to another portion of your presentation, which was the financial outlook for the City of Hamilton. And once again, we seem to be in pretty good shape as we head for the next 2 years, at least, of the current council term.
And I think it's important in working with our partners, be it the federal, provincial government, and certainly communicating with this community, for everyone to know exactly where we're at financially and how we're running the show. So, you know, what you see in this slide here is the fact that the last 4 years we've been below inflation in terms of tax increases. And certainly the last 2 years the departments have been at zero or below in terms of increased costs. From a credit ratings perspective, which is something that is established by outside parties, we're AA strong and stable. In fact, our credit rating, believe it or not, is better than the provincial government's. We got strong reserves and cash flow with a moderate amount of debt right now, and that debt will increase somewhat in the next few years when we expand our water wastewater system. As I say, our economy is continuing to grow and outpace others in Ontario. And that, as our auditor indicated, overall, we certainly have very good financial management practices.
One of the things that needs to be mentioned about the stable the AA stable rating by Standard & Poor's, right, is that it keeps the cost of borrowing down. Any city, like any business, has to borrow, and the lower your interest charges, the better it is.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there are certainly others that have higher credit ratings. AAA is the highest, but those municipalities in this country are few and far between, and given all the challenges that we face in Hamilton, the fact that we are AA strong, stable credit is, you're right, it does keep our costs down as well.
Chris Murray, our guest city manager, and now we get on to Service Delivery Review, which many cities across Canada and in North America are doing. So how would you explain that to the average person?
I mean, first and foremost, we are a public service, and it's as logical as the fact that we're a public service that we should at some point describe for people what services in fact they receive. Typically, though, if you want to find out what we do for the $1.4 billion that we spend a year, you would look at our budget books and you would be hard-pressed to understand what they actually mean. And so, as you point out, Mr. Mayor, many municipalities in this country have taken to trying to describe what they do in a service delivery format. So, as it stands, we've gone through the process. We've identified that we provide citizens of Hamilton and businesses 89 services and 256 subservices. So there's a lot of services being provided out there, and we have taken the time to explain what those services are, what they cost, how many people are responsible for providing them. Where we can, we compare ourselves to others that provide the same service in Ontario, as well as we make clear what the standards we're trying to achieve and how important those services are. So anyone that's interested, and certainly to a city manager, I'm extremely interested, as is the mayor and council, you can see the profile of all of our services on our website.
And once again, transparency, accountability to taxpayers, and even the simple review, I think, is important of what it is we do. And I worked in 45 years in broadcasting for 9 different companies and 17 different managements. And some of those were doing very well and some were struggling. And once the struggling starts, not that we're struggling, but it was always important for management, or especially new management coming in, to look at problems. Well, what is it we do? You know, and now we've got this guy who's renting out our vehicle. Why are we in that business? You know, that's taking away resources and so on. And I would apply that same approach to what we're doing.
Well, absolutely. And so when we looked at all of our services and sub-services, we looked at them from the standpoint of what's mandatory, i.e. what is provincially, federally legislated that we must do. Fire prevention would be one, for example. We looked at those services that are essential. And in the case of when you have 7,500 employees, they will be paid, and you must make sure that you have accounting practices in place to pay them. We looked at services, and some are described as traditional. We're not legislated to provide recreational service, but traditionally we have. And then you have those that are discretionary, and that it's really up to council as to whether or not they want to continue to provide those services. And you know, historically, we have looked at things like golf courses, and we have looked at things like we own an aviary, for example, that, you know, do we necessarily need to have an aviary? So that's what this process has done. It's enabled us to look at all our services and put them into those 4 basic categories.
So how would you differentiate the service delivery review with the budget process, where councillors will hear submissions from the various departments and agree or disagree, or discuss the funding amounts in the various budgets? This is different from that, isn't it?
Yeah, this is fundamentally different. And as you pointed out, Mr. Mayor, in the beginning, a number of municipalities are starting to gravitate towards using a service delivery model as a way to explain where they spend their money and what they get for the money. So right now, I think it's important to businesses and citizens, certainly in this community, to know whether or not the services we provide, for example, we do them efficiently. And so there are comparison data in all of our profiles that show how we compare to others that provide the same service. So if we're worse than them, then that means we got some homework to go and take care of. If we're as good, if not better, then maybe others will be coming to talk to us as to how we do it. So the budget process, the way it has traditionally been, it's a lot of numbers on a page with a lot of 1 or 2 words description as to what that money is being spent on.
Now there's a slide up right now that perhaps you can, as the city manager, give some explanation to.
Right. So when we looked at all of our services, we broke them down into levels of service. So for example, where there are standards, and in many cases, as you can see here, 85% of all of our services and sub-services have are at a standard that has been established. 4% are above standard, which to those listening, that may not be cause for excitement, but I got to tell you, if I'm providing more service than I have to, then I think council needs to know that, and we can make some decisions as to whether or not we want to remain above standard. Where we have 3% are below standard, and if those are mandatory services that we're providing and they're below standard, that's a concern, because you can find yourself exposed from a liability standpoint and other standpoints. So below standard isn't good either, and so in those cases we got to find out why we're below and what we can do to fix it. And the last one, 8% requires standards. And in this case, and that excites me because at the end of the day, in terms of accountability, I want to make sure that our senior leadership is accountable for all the services. And where I don't have standards for something, I need to get standards, because at the end of the day, I want to be able to say to people that we are meeting expectations. And in this particular case, most of the services that we provide that don't have standards are in the service support category. In other words, groups like legal, purchasing, risk, human services, human resource services, areas of our business like that provide support to our departments. We have not had standards in those areas, and I think it's critical that we get service agreements established so that I can certainly hold those accountable for achieving what they ought to be achieving.
Chris Murray, our city manager, in a city that spends $1.4 billion a year. We saw this slide earlier. This is probably what impacts the viewer the most if you're a residential taxpayer in the city of Hamilton, is how much is it costing to get these services. And so it's important that we have a clear understanding as a council what the services that we're supposed to provide and how we're doing at providing it. And so that, as I say, may not be the most interesting discussion around the, in the coffee shops, but it's so vitally important for us because, and the city has done a good job, and I have to say this, Chris, that we came in at 0.8 or something above zero. We're almost at zero, one of the lowest, next to London, the lowest in the province. But being at zero, when you bring inflation into account, means that we're actually below zero. Like, I think the staff really did a good job in terms of the things that we could afford, that we could affect. Police budgets and built-in contractual obligations, they're aside, and there would be 3-4% increases in some areas. But in terms of how the city functions, I think you'll agree with me that we did a pretty darn good job last go-around in terms of staying below the mark.
Absolutely agree. I mean, obviously we had pretty clear direction from council a few years back in terms of trying to achieve zero and try to do it without affecting services. And the way in which we've been able to do it is through attrition, staff leaving, not always having to replace staff where we can, and in some cases through reorganization of our departments. And so we've been doing that. I think a lot has been accomplished. It's not easy. It'll get more difficult as time goes on. There's little doubt in my mind as inflation continues to rise, as our wages continue to go up, although the contracts we've had with the unions have been very favorable. In fact, I would say to you that they've led many of the other unions across the province in terms of the increases. We still have challenging times, and when you put on top of that our infrastructure deficit, where we should be spending about $200 million more a year over the next 10 years. And with an aging population, I mean, it is critical that taxpayers see value for their money, and that, in essence, is why we've done what we've done. And so I applaud council for giving us the chance to put the information together and help them and help ourselves make some tough decisions.
Chris, all in all, as we close off in the last 30 seconds or so of this portion of our show, the city is in a place it hasn't been in decades in terms of growth, in terms of the positive forecasting, the 2.5% growth prediction, and all those other things you mentioned off of the top. So I hope residents understand that. It's always easy to criticize, and we're here to be criticized and to try to react to good criticism. But at some point in this year, I think that we have to admit that we're in a darn good position as a city, thanks to the tremendous efforts right throughout all of our staff and council.
Appreciate that, and you're right, this is a banner year, and we expect great things in the future.
Chris Murray, the City Manager of the City of Hamilton. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Bob Bratina's Hamilton. I'm the Mayor of the City of Hamilton, Bob Bratina. Our city went through an amazing sequence of events surrounding the passing of the Honorable Lincoln Alexander. After lying in state at Queen's Park, Mr. Alexander was brought to Hamilton, his adopted city, and we had a remarkable lying in repose, as they say. Lying in state means at the Queen's Park Legislature, and then in repose here at City Hall. So while I'm sharing some stories with you about the event, let's take a look at some of the photos and video that occurred throughout the time of the funeral of Lincoln Alexander. And on a personal note, I first got to know Lincoln about 1966 when I was covering the courts as a radio reporter, and he was still in the courtroom as a lawyer defending his clients. But it was after that that I found out that his connection with our family goes back even farther, because Lincoln Alexander was the lawyer to my wife's grandmother, Mrs. Skolinski, many years before I even knew my wife. And it was interesting too, because Ed Skolinski, her son, my wife's late uncle, was a police officer. And I'm sure that's how the Lincoln Alexander's legal firm got connected with my wife's family. And so the stories were really wonderful in terms of an issue that she was having that was quite troubling. And Link actually had to wipe a tear from his eye as he was encountering and trying to resolve some of these problems. So my wife's family knew for many years the decency and integrity of this man. So time moves on, and as a radio reporter, I'm now in his campaign headquarters on the night of his victory in 1968. And what a time that was, with a wonderful victory celebration that featured the piano artistry of Oscar Peterson. That was one of the many, many celebrities that Lincoln encountered in his wonderful life, and celebrities who felt that he was a good friend of theirs. It was not a case. Link had that way of connecting with people. And some of the stories we heard as we spoke to Hamiltonians and people who came from out of town to visit and say their last goodbyes to Link in the scenes that you see there, they had some incredible stories that would not normally be known to the public. There was a couple of mixed race, a black woman and a white man from South Africa, who wanted to get married and did get married back in the 1960s, and knew that they had no future in terms of the situation in South Africa at that time, and wanted to immigrate to Canada. But it was interesting that the Immigration Department was wanting to bring them in as refugees, and they said, no, we don't consider ourselves refugees. We want to come in as normal immigrants. And it was Lincoln Alexander who worked behind the scenes in his role as not yet a cabinet minister, but as a member of Parliament, and then later as a cabinet minister in the Joe Clark government, to see that they were admitted to Canada as proper immigrants. And so they had never forgotten that, hadn't seen Link in years and years, but were determined to be a part of the remarkable lying in repose that occurred here in Hamilton. So many people never got to know Link until his later days, when he was riding in his famous mobility scooter down from Atrium to his favorite spot downtown, which was, of course, Denninger's. And that's where Link and I had many, many discussions about politics in the city and so on. He really loved Herta and Austin Murray and the Denningers, and was always there and welcomed anybody who came up to speak to him. But it was interesting to see him proceeding up King Street in his scooter and stopping to talk to just about anyone who obviously recognized him, because he was so recognizable. People have asked me, for instance, what his legacy is. And I hope that his legacy will be the goodness in this man's heart, which sometimes is lost, and perhaps we see it in more difficult ways in the political life when so much of what we deal with is criticism. Link always walked tall. He always had a good word for everybody. And he approached life in a very positive way. And if you read his biography, his autobiography, you will realize the troubles that he had in his life. Simply being black in North America through his time on this earth from the 1920s through to now, but especially in the 40s and the 50s, not a great time to be a black person in North America because of the obvious racism that occurred. When he was elected, I remember asking him that question: how important is it for you to be a man of your race in the federal government at this time in black history? And remember, this was the time of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and all of that. And he said, I intend to represent my constituents in the West Hamilton riding equally without differentiation. And he would willingly deal with issues of race as they came along. But he did not pretend to be only functioning in that category. It was interesting, too, because shortly after his victory, he had a wonderful article written about him in the famous black-focused magazine called Ebony. And he made the same comment in there. And it was absolutely the right comment to make. And Link had perhaps the greatest effect in terms of his race in being a role model, in setting an example, in showing leadership by example. And perhaps the most important thing was this optimism that he had. And I'll never forget, to me, his greatest moment, and that was the speech he made at the banquet that was arranged after the burning of the Hindu Samaj temple. And that was an atrocity that occurred after the 9/11 attacks in New York. And a few days later, that temple on 20 Road was burned. And a fundraising banquet was arranged, and Lincoln Alexander was the keynote speaker. And what he said, I don't think anybody else that I know of could have said it in the same way with the same impact. He looked at these people, visible minorities, many from origins outside of Canada, and said, I feel your pain. And his speech was not about agony and reprisal and hatred and vengeance. It was about renewal and building and moving forward. And that congregation at the Hindu Samaj temple has continued in the spirit of that to this day. And I attended not so long ago, as a matter of fact. And they continue not to reflect back. They do, of course, acknowledge the terrible thing that happened to their temple and the impact that it had on their congregation. But they were determined, as Link said in his speech, to think about renewal and building and growth, and don't let this set you back, because you have all of the rights and all of the potential any Canadian should have. And it was brilliant. So Lincoln Alexander, our friend, is gone, but what will his legacy be? And so I hope it is that we can think more positively about each other, and especially about our city, because the final legacy is that Lincoln Alexander adopted Hamilton. He was born in Toronto. He has his wonderful Caribbean connections. But if you ask Lincoln Alexander, he would tell you he is a Hamiltonian, and a proud one. Currently, there is an opportunity. Some people are talking about having perhaps a statue erected to Mr. Alexander and placed somewhere in the area of City Hall. And I would certainly support that, but I really want it to be grassroots. So if you think that you would like to be a part of that, you'll hear more about this in the days and weeks to come. But we got one of the greatest gifts that we could in allowing all of Canada to see Hamilton take on its beloved adopted son and see him off to his rest in a brilliant state funeral held in Hamilton. I'm Bob Bratina, the Mayor of the City of Hamilton, and we'll be back in just a moment. I'm Mayor Bob Bratina. Recently we had an interesting presence in our city, military helicopters training as they were using some of our tall buildings downtown for an anti-terrorist training exercise. And there was some discussion about that, and it gave me the opportunity to remind everyone that Hamilton is and has been for the better part of 200 years a garrison city, a military garrison city of some importance. And this is a unique honor for a city to have. And you look back to the Roman Empire and some of the great cities that ultimately grew, such as London, England, from small cities in the old Roman Empire. These were the garrison cities that became the capitals. And so we have a continuing strong military presence in Hamilton, which all begins, of course, back in the War of 1812, when Burlington Heights were occupied by General Sir John Vincent, and now occupied by Dundurn Castle, which was built by Sir Allan MacNab, who was a boy soldier. He was 15 years old and on a Navy ship in that war. And so we had the militia, the 2nd York Militia, which took its recruits from the area now occupied by our city. They were the first citizen soldiers, and this was the beginning of Hamilton as a garrison town, and it has been ever since. There is a great presence in terms of real estate, the large armories, the facilities that are down at the harbor front around where Haida is now proudly anchored. And of course, there are the wages that are paid and a certain amount of taxes, procurements, but the simple honor that so many great men and women have served our country through the garrison of Hamilton. So one of my promises when I took this job on was to reacquaint Hamiltonians with the fact that we are an important Canadian military city, and those helicopters flying over our downtown a few days ago were simply proof of that, and it was an honor to host that opportunity. My name is Bob Bratina. I'm the Mayor of the City of Hamilton, and thanks for being with us.